Dr. Anand, may I start?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. So warm greetings to one and all with us today, this afternoon, this evening. What should I say? I mean, we have participants from all over the world, it seems. Hearty welcome to all our esteemed panelists for the day, Dr. Sujoy and Dr. John Dumay. It is a matter of great privilege to host an event of this order. We have participants from more than 20 plus countries. Thanks to College of Banking and Financial Studies for helping us in promoting the event of this order. The countries from which we are having representation are Oman, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, UAE, Qatar, Afghanistan, Namibia, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Bosnia, Tunisia, UK, Ethiopia, Kuwait, Nepal, Portugal, Australia, Iraq, Malaysia, Zimbabwe, Nigeria, and of course, India, a big number from India, of course. On behalf of Jaipuria Institute of Management, I welcome you all to this international webinar jointly hosted by College of Banking and Financial Studies and Jaipuria Institute of Management. Without much ado, in the interest of time, I initiate the proceedings of the webinar. I now invite Dr. Fatin Al-Jadzali, Assistant Dean for Academic Support and Student Affairs, College of Banking and Financial Studies, Oman, to deliver the welcome address and initiate the theme. Over to you, Dr. Fatin.
Many thanks. Thank you, Dr. Sushma. Delegates and colleagues across the world, very good morning to you all, or afternoon for the ones who are joining from the Gulf. It gives me an immense pleasure to welcome you at the international webinar on qualitative research methods in finance, which is organized jointly by the College of Banking and Financial Studies and Jaipuria. Today's webinar promotes knowledge transfer initiative, and the main aim of the webinar is to provide a scholarly platform to discuss the impact of qualitative research and publication requirements for top-ranked journals. The webinar is expected to produce a deep understanding of quality research publications and improve quality of applied research. Ladies and gentlemen, qualitative research, in my opinion, has been underestimated, although it lays the ground for quantitative research. In fact, while I have submitted one of my papers in a conference, which I co-authored with one of my supervisors at the time when I did my PhD, I have been declined politely due to reasons that it does not fit the nature of the conference proceedings due to the over-reliance on quantitative papers. Due to the qualitative papers based on non-numerical data, it is often difficult to evidence. However, qualitative research always helps us to develop concepts, frameworks, and hypotheses. This is done when we are synthesizing the literature to explore a new angle or dimension in the field. Qualitative research is also methodological in the use of techniques such as focus group interviews and observations. In my PhD thesis, for instance, I have used quasi method, I consider myself. I have used the structural equation modeling, which is converting the qualitative data into a quantitative one for evidencing. One of the major fields created in the last 10 to 15 years is sustainability, now gaining a huge momentum in the world due to the fact that it has been evolving from common CSR in environmental science into the form of sustainability. In fact, sustainability has its own journal nowadays, and this is only done by challenging the theories that we are having today and challenging as well the status quo. Dear delegates, I do not want my welcome to be a strain. There is a lot of beautiful material which is going to be discussed today. Hence, I conclude, because I know that there is a lot of good discussions that we're gonna view today. I once again extend my warm welcome to you from Oman. At the moment, I'm staged over here. I'm very honored to be here once again. And I wish you a delightful and stimulating discussion in this webinar. And inshallah, it will result to quality publication for your own future career. Have a nice day and thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fatin. So we now begin with the first session. The eminent speaker for the first session is Dr. John Dumay. Good evening, Dr. John.
Good evening.
My sincere thanks to you for joining us at this hour. I think it must be time for relaxing. It's around 8 p.m. in Australia.
It is.
Nonetheless, you joined us. Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Dr. John, all the participants, I would just like to read out a brief bio. Of course, I can't, make any justice to the illustrious career profile he has to his credit. Still, just to give you a glimpse of it, Dr. John is an Associate Professor of Accounting and Finance in Macquarie University, Australia. Formerly a consultant, he joined academia after completing his PhD in 2008. His thesis won the European Fund for Management Development and Emerald Journal's Outstanding Doctoral Research Award for Knowledge Management. John researches intellectual capital, knowledge management, accounting, corporate reporting and disclosure, research methodologies, and academic writing. In 2020, John reached more than 10,000 Google Scholar citations from over 120 peer-reviewed articles, book chapters, and books. He is an associate editor of the highly regarded category A-star journal, Accounting, Auditing, and Accountability Journal. He is also an associate editor of category A journal, which is Meditary Accounting Research, and a deputy editor for Accounting and Finance, which is again a category A journal. Before I hand over to you, I also take the opportunity to congratulate you in person for your most recent recognition as Australia's top researcher in accounting and taxation. Many congratulations, Dr. John.
Thank you very much.
I request the participants having any questions for Dr. John to type their questions in question and answer. Over to you, Dr. John.
Thank you very much. Okay, share the screen. Good. Okay. So good evening, everybody, and Dr. Sushma, very much thanks for inviting me. As you say, it is a little bit late in Sydney. It's 8 p.m. and I'm looking forward to having a bit of a rest. It's been a long day. However, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for inviting me, because it's always a pleasure to speak to an international audience. And I see there's over 200 people already online. So very nice time to be talking to a good amount of people. So my presentation is more of the macro, as we had discussed. So Sushma has asked me to do the suitability of qualitative research methods, but through an editorial perspective. And as I was introduced, I've done a lot of editorial work in my day. I'm a former associate editor of the Journal of Intellectual Capital, which many of you may know. And I was also editor of the Electronic Journal of Knowledge Management. However, about 2 years ago, I was appointed to the as associate editor of Accounting, Auditing, Accountability Journal. And then I decided that maybe that's going to keep me very busy, and it actually does keep me quite busy. Just a little flash, we always have the official picture, so that's me. I like to get people to know me a little bit. If you click on that hyperlink later on, you can actually see a lot more of my profile and some of the research I do. Of course, you can also go onto places like Google Scholar, ResearchGate, and Scopus, and even Web of Science. I've got some profiles and Populons there. And I've always found it really good to promote my research through the internet and through these different websites. I've been at Macquarie University now for approximately 7 years. I'll be in my 7th year this December. Previously, I had spent 5 years at the University of Sydney. So I'm a bit of a late bloomer, as you would say, for a researcher. So I was actually running my own consulting practice for over 15 years before I decided at 38 to go back to university and do some learning, which was a very good experience. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that. As you've been said, I come from Australia, but a lot of people might be saying, well, you don't sound very Australian. And the reason I don't sound very Australian is because I spent my formative years from the time I was 7 till 20 living in Canada. So I speak very much with the Canadian accent that everybody in Australia thinks I do. And a lot of my students appreciate my Canadian accent because at the end of the day, they find listening to a true Australian accent rather difficult. And we have a lot of international students from China, India, Bangladesh, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, that type of thing. So they seem to find the Canadian accent a bit easier. However, most interestingly, I was born down here in this little place, Tasmania. Does anybody know what Tasmania is famous for?
Prison.
Prison, yeah, we were part of that, the prisons. But any other guesses what we might be famous for? It's this little fella here. He's called the Tasmanian Devil. And I think that's interesting because I kind of, from a research perspective, that's me. I am the devil's advocate, for want of a better word. And being a qualitative researcher, being a social scientist, allows me to have that kind of leeway to not only do my research and ask good questions, but it also allows me to be a good critical scholar. And playing the devil's advocate really means that you have to question everything. We only know what we know today because we've questioned what we knew yesterday. And my job as a researcher, as a professor, as an editor, is to ensure that new knowledge is created, and not only created, but disseminated. So we have to spread that out. And I think that's a really important role that we have to understand. I think from a qualitative research perspective, is extremely important, because sometimes if we do research that is, the same as everybody else's research, I sometimes call that copycat research, then what are we actually adding to the paradigm? The other thing you have to know about me too is I also, I'm a professor of accounting and finance, and I actually call myself an accidental accountant. And the accidental accountant kind of streams from when I was in Canada as a young boy. I did extremely well at high school, and I finished my high school when I was 16 years old. And my mother was very, very impressed. She says, well, John, you've been a very good boy, so you should be packing your bags and going off to university and study accounting because you're very good with numbers. So my mother was very encouraging for me to study accounting. And at 16 years old, I couldn't think of anything worse that I wanted to do than study accounting. So I decided not to go to university to study accounting, and instead went to work with my father in construction for a while, doing some building work. And then I went back to school at 18, and I did an engineering degree. So my first qualification is as an industrial engineer. And one of the things that we learned from the early days of being an engineer, if you want to understand how something works, you actually have to kind of pull it apart and put it back together again. So I actually ended up working in manufacturing for many years and climbed to the ranks of middle management in manufacturing for some big companies like Goodyear Tire and Rubber, and the Smorgon Group here in Australia, which was a producer of reinforcing steel for construction projects. So then I struck out as a consultant, and then I was doing a lot of business consultant work, especially in manufacturing and then in hospitality. And I was getting some very good work, and the state government here approached me, and I was working for another guy, and they said, look, John, we want you to do the work because you're very good at it, and please put your application in with your tender, which we did, or which I did. And then all of a sudden they said to me, we have a small problem. I said, what's that? They said, your problem is that you don't have an MBA. And if you're going to be consulting at this level and being paid this kind of money from the government, your minimum required is for you to have an MBA. So at 38 years old, I went back to university. And I finished my MBA, and then I did really well at my MBA and started a doctoral program. And before I knew it, I was at the University of Sydney, and Professor James Guthrie, who's one of the most famous accounting professors in the world, ended up as my PhD supervisor. And so I ended up doing a PhD in accounting. And I thought this was really great because my mother will now be very happy because now I actually have a degree in accounting, and not only a degree, but a PhD. So when she came to the ceremony for the PhD celebration, she said, "Oh, John, fantastic. However, look, maybe if you had done what I told you to do 35 years ago, you could have accomplished so much more." So it kind of shows you that you can never always please your mother. But the problem that we have that when we get into academia, so I got a job in academia, and one of the problems that we have is called the publish or perish problem. So there's a lot of people out there who have got their degrees, and they find it extremely difficult to get published. Only about 4% of all accounting academics actually publish in what we call top-tier journals. The other 96% struggle. I was fairly fortunate that some of my papers out of my PhD got published in very good journals. And one of the things that I kind of prided myself on, not prided myself on, but as an engineer, I kind of took the publish or perish paradigm on and said, well, if I want to really understand how to do research or how to write research, I needed to pull it apart, put it back together. So my friend Charles de Villiers and I, we did some research on papers that were published rather than what didn't get you published. So we were looked at the attributes of published papers. And what we found there was a set of rules or a recipe that you could follow for publication. So that paper is published in AAAJ, Accounting, Auditing, and Accountability Journal. And if you want to know a little bit more about the construction of how a paper should be put together, that would be very valuable. However, the idea for my presentation today is about my role as an editor and how I see qualitative research from an editorial perspective. And I know there's, we sometimes call it the accounting research battlefield. You've got the positivists on one side, you've got us qualitative guys on the other side. And, they have different viewpoints. They have a different epistemology, a different ontology. In fact, I'm just finishing another paper off for AAAJ where we talk about these battles between the positivists and the qualitative people. And I think that if we take 2 steps backwards, we don't have to have that kind of a battlefield. I think we can actually work together quite nicely. So you can see from the journals that I'm associate editor of, both AAAJ is very much a qualitative research journal. It's not to say that you cannot publish quantitative research in there, but the remit of the journal is very much about sustainability. It's very much about the social sciences. It's very much about accounting's impact on society and the environment and so forth. It is not like the accounting review in the US where, you publish a lot of quantitative positivist type studies using agency theory or whatever in order to understand how the capital markets work. This is probably the antithesis of how the capital markets might better work within the remit of sustainability and society and the environment. So it's very much focused that way. Meditari accountancy research, I think, sits middle ground. So it will accept papers both from an empirical positivist perspective as well as qualitative articles. So it's very much more a catch-all. And what Meditari is really looking for is innovation. Really interesting, different, innovative type articles. We've just published a special issue there on the European directive on non-financial disclosures, and very interesting to understand how that's working. Of course, you can actually do empirical studies, but it's mainly qualitative studies. Then we have on the right-hand side, accounting and finance. And accounting and finance is mainly a positivist journal. But the cover that I've actually put up here for the Accounting and Finance is a special issue that I edited with Professor Charles de Villiers from New Zealand, from Auckland, on qualitative research. So this entire special issue, I think, has 14 papers dedicated to qualitative research. And basically, my role as a deputy editor is to handle a lot of the qualitative papers that come through. So if you would submit a qualitative paper to Accounting and Finance, either myself or Professor de Villiers will probably be your managing editor for that paper. And Accounting and Finance is the journal of the Australian Accounting and Finance Association of Australia and New Zealand, which I'm a member of. And what we're trying to do with this journal is to show that both qualitative and quantitative type studies can be published all at the same time in one journal. So that's been good. So what is my job as an editor? I'd really like to say that my fundamental job is to help scholars get published. So we as editors have a very big role in not only being the gatekeepers of research, but being the ones that actually help people get published. For example, sometimes I might go to a conference and I might see a paper that's being presented and I go, wow, fantastic, this is a very interesting paper. And I might actually approach that author and encourage them to submit their paper. And basically what we're trying to do is to ensure that when good research comes in, or even research that needs a bit of work, we give people the opportunity to work on that research so that they can improve it. And qualitative research is sometimes even more difficult because and we'll talk about this a little bit more later, is that what its contribution isn't based on a set of rules that you would get from an empirical analysis, right? So this is one of the challenges that we have with qualitative research is how do you actually develop the reliability or what we call the trustworthiness of the findings. And that's got a little bit to do with epistemology and ontology. And we look at that when we look at the differences between what we see is quantitative versus qualitative research. And they're fundamentally two different things. And this is why sometimes we have this kind of battlefield approach. To me, I actually wrote about this in my thesis and said, to me, qualitative research and quantitative research still has the same what we call hermeneutical problem. In other words, when you start putting labels on numbers, this is a variable, you put a label on it. You're actually putting a qualitative label on a quantitative number. And then does that label that you put on that number or set of numbers mean the same thing to everybody else? And then it actually becomes just as interpretivist. I don't like to use the word subjective, but it's how you interpret the label that you have. So for example, the word profit, we like to use profit or earnings in our quantitative analysis. But is one company's earnings the same as any other company's earnings? Because what we tend to do is aggregate these numbers under these labels. And in essence, we do very much a similar thing when we do qualitative research, but we aggregate things under a label, but it's generally text and other numbers and so forth, and which are not, our methods of analysis are, of course, quite different. So in the quantitative side, we generally we have structured data, we have statistical analysis, we have objective conclusions, we have things like surveys and experiments. Now, when you do that quantitative research, sometimes that's what you have. You have structured data. So if you have structured data, you ask research questions and around that structured data, and therefore that becomes the relevant methodology. However, when you have unstructured data, we don't have numbers. As I said, we have different sources of data. for example, interviews, focus groups, observations, those are the main ones. Text analysis, which I'll talk about in a minute or two. What we're doing is, it's more what I call an interpretive conclusion rather than subjective conclusion. Subjective means more of an opinion, but I'd like to say when you interpret something, you can actually put some very good robustness to that interpretation. So when then is qualitative research very appropriate? Well, we want to answer research questions and explore accounting and finance in ways that is not available to quantitative research methods. As we say, sometimes the data that we get is not going to be quantitative. And generally when we're doing this, it's like a case study. And what we're trying to do is ask two very fundamental questions. Rather than what is happening, which is what quantitative analysis does, we generally ask the question, how did something happen? Why did something happen? We want to look for explanations. So something goes, you know, for example, the global financial crisis. It would really be interesting to know why it happened. And there are a lot of papers investigating why the global financial crisis happened. Who were the players? What did they do? What were the laws? What were the regulations? What were the issues? How did how did these financial instruments get so overvalued that they ended up being a bubble and bursting? And we've seen this throughout history. It's not just the global financial crisis. It started back in the 1700s with the tulip frenzy in Europe, in Amsterdam, where people were buying, tulip bulbs for the price of a house. And why were they doing that? Because they wanted to earn money. They got greedy. They got caught up in the whole bubble. And we see this throughout human history. We have economic bubbles. We have housing bubbles. We have lots of these things, fads, whatever else that come through. We want to understand how these things happen. We want to learn from these events to inform us when these things start happening again. It's not something that you can do very easily with quantitative research. So qualitative research has its place. Quantitative research has its place. It is good to understand how capital markets work from an accounting basis, because that informs accounting policy. For example, the research that went in around earnings management, the original papers around that are very interesting, because what they could show from a financial perspective is that there was manipulation of the market, and maybe that this manipulation may be unethical. And maybe there's some regulations that needed to be changed because these things were coming through in accounting. However, we also want to know who are the players, what's the motivations, and these things you can't easily do by analyzing numbers. You actually have to go in and talk to people and try to understand how things are happening and what is the way forward. For example, at the moment, almost every single journal that I know of is having a special issue on COVID-19. What is the impact of COVID-19 on particular areas of research, especially in accounting? Just recently in AAAJ, we've closed a special issue on COVID-19 and accounting, and there's some really super interesting papers in there. One of the papers that we submitted was questioning how governments were responding to the crisis, and they didn't know the numbers. There was no accounting. There were no numbers available. We didn't know, these were best guess estimates. So when we look at accounting and we looked at what a good quality accounting is, with reliable numbers, with timely numbers, all the qualitative aspects of accounting, we just didn't have it. It was like we were almost running blind. And although governments still were able to function, and we need to understand how these things happen and how governments responded and how policymakers responded, because that will actually inform possible future crises. So there's a real interesting work at the moment going on everywhere, and there's no numbers really to analyze over the long term because we have such a short. So one of the real advantages of qualitative research is getting in there early when a phenomenon happens to ask how and why things happened. And I think that's really important, because then the quantitative research then comes off that and says, well, these are the things that qualitative research has espoused and maybe theorized might happen. And then we can actually, when the data becomes available, then we can actually go and understand, you know, was there a general rule of thumb that could have been applied to that situation? Another thing that's very different about qualitative research is the form of reasoning. So when we do quantitative research, we're looking at the relationships between numbers, and we have strength of our analysis, we have our dummy variables, we have our p-values, we have a certain amount of reliability, and we can kind of prove that statistically. Now, the issue that we have really with a lot of qualitative research is that we don't use inductive or deductive reasoning. We use what we call abductive reasoning. And abductive reasoning, I like to have the analogy that it is using the wisdom of the great detective Sherlock Holmes. Because what you do with qualitative research is that you try to put pieces of a puzzle. It's a big jigsaw puzzle sometimes. And if Sherlock Holmes solves a case, he tries to present this evidence, which is generally circumstantial. You know, nobody was there to witness the crime. This is the problem we have with crime. Nobody there is to witness it. The same problem we have with sometimes with accounting and finance. We have these phenomenons, and nobody is there always. Not one person was ever the sole eyewitness to this phenomenon. So what you have to do is you have to gather that evidence through interviews, through documents, through focus groups, from all these other methods. And you have to bring that data together and organize and collate it so that you can create a story based on circumstantial evidence that is so strong that the truth or the trustworthiness of that story comes out. And that's the difference, where you have your analysis and quant research to use your p-values and your correlations and so forth. Qualitative research doesn't have that. We have a much more focused reasoning, and we want to bring evidence to make a very strong case for what we see. And not everyone's going to come up with the same answer, whereas you would expect that in quant research. One of the big issues that I always try to talk about and discuss with people is what I call the difference between methodology and method. So basically, methodology refers to what we call the philosophical issues or research paradigms that influence the research methods. So for example, I'm just going to use Robert Yin's book, Case Study Research, which I label a methodology because Yin has an epistemology, an ontology. He talks about it in a particular way. And within case study research, you can actually use lots of different research methods. So for example, interviews, we can use content analysis, we can use even text analysis. But when you look at even these methods, you can even call these methodologies, because if you read my paper with Sandy Chu on interviews, we have a philosophical foundation about how these interviews can be done, and they can be done in many different ways. They can be structured, semi-structured, they can be unstructured. And depending on the way you view your research, you can do them in different ways. The same goes with content analysis. So the famous book by Krippendorf, which is now in the 6th or 7th edition, he calls content analysis a methodology. And there are many different ways you can do content analysis. For example, you can do form-oriented, which means you're ticking the boxes and saying, how many times does this word appear? Or you can even do meaning-oriented, which is your interpretation of the text. So even within content analysis, there is even some quant and qualitative methodologies as well. I believe then we have also text analysis in the good paper by Lee Parker and Roffey, and they talk about open and axial coding, which they basically get from grounded theory. So from grounded theory, you build up your interviews, you analyze, you learn, you continue to do this, and then all of a sudden you start developing different codes and you bring them together, and then you start forming a theory about how something works. So even within the research methodologies, qualitative methodologies, we have different ways of doing things, and it all depends on what your epistemology is and the way that you're going to tackle that research. And each research methodology and the way that you analyze something is actually also sometimes dependent on the data. So therefore, if your data is text, you will probably use content analysis or some form of text analysis to do that. If your data is interviews of people, then yes, interviews and then subsequent analysis or text analysis of that will go well. So what are the tools for qualitative research? So you've got lots of things like Stata and SPSS and everything else for your quant stuff. The go-to program that I always recommend to everybody is NVivo 12. So NVivo is actually an Australian product. And it is a fantastic, you would think of it, I would describe it as a research database. So you can store in NVivo all your text, all your documents, your transcripts of your interviews, the sound recordings, videos, many, many, many different things you can actually have in your NVivo toolkit. And I like that because you can also do your analysis, run reports, and so forth. So that is, to me, is what we call a qualitative research database, which you can also use for organizing and analyzing your data. And just to be a little bit different, we have also Leximancer. So Leximancer is more specifically, for example, a text analysis. And from there, what you can do is you can do text analysis and then convert those and that analysis into visualizations. So you not only have like a content analysis, but you can have a visual representation of how different words and paradigms, or sort of different words and categories are actually available in the text that you have. So that'd be something very interesting if you wanted to pursue that. So towards my closing here, what I'd like to say is to quant and qualitative research, doesn't really matter what you're doing. I think one of the things that you have to avoid is what we call furphy research. And furphy is a very Australian name. And you can see here, furphy it's got a name on a water cart. And furphy in Australian means something that sounds true, but maybe isn't quite true. And what happened was that in the First World War, the Australian troops were in the Sinai. And of course, they had no radio or other form of telephone communications those days. And the Australian government got these water carts because they're used on farms to transport water. And they brought them to the Sinai to top up the water supplies of the troops. And because they had no forms of communication, the only form of communication that they really had from one camp to the next camp was the guy who was driving the water truck or the water tank. And he would, of course, as young men do, there would be stories, and they would kind of embellish those stories a little bit to sound kind of true, but not quite true. And this is what we see a lot of times in qualitative research, and why it sometimes has a bit of a bad name. It's because people do an interpretation, but they might get a little bit sloppy about the methodology, or they might even kind of come to their own conclusion without really giving that robustness of that abductive reasoning. So what we need to do when we do qualitative research is these things. First of all, as our opening speaker said, you've really got to question the status quo. Your research must be interesting. It must always challenge what is currently known. If you don't challenge what is currently known, and you do furphy research or research that somebody else has done and you're just repeating it, it's not going to go a long way. When you write your research, you have to tell it. It has to have a protagonist. You have to write research like a narrative. When you write up your quant research, you have your experiments, you have your hypotheses, you have this. Here, it's like writing a story. You actually have to have a main character. that main character needs to be pulled through the entire paper, because if it doesn't, it becomes disjointed. When we use theory, quant research is very much theory driven. So therefore, positive accounting theory, agency theory is generally at the heart of most quant research. However, I always espouse that in qualitative research, you do it the other way around. You start your analysis, and once you start your analysis, then you start looking and thinking about the different theories that might be available to best explain what you see. So theories are not used to drive the research. Generally, theories are used to explain the paradigm or the phenomenon. The other thing we shouldn't do as qualitative researchers is apologize for not being able to draw statistical generalizations. Sometimes we have a sample of one company. You know, it's not it's not a sample of another subset. And we do not do what we call statistical generalizations. And I think this is one of the greatest things you need to realize, that if you become a qualitative researcher, as qualitative researchers, what we do is we have qualitative generalizations. What we're out is to learn from the research, learn to inform us as both researchers, as academics, as practitioners, because we're always looking at accounting in action, for example. We want to be able to do the generalizations, and a qualitative generalization means, what did I learn from something? What did I internalize from this that I can take forward and to help inform practice or help inform future research? It is not statistical at all. There's a great paper by Lee Parker and Daryl Northcott in AAAJ that looks at qualitative generalization. And if you read anything from Robert Yin in his case study research book, he says this is the true mark of a good case study researcher, when they realize it's not about statistical generalizations, but qualitative generalizations. And that's where I'll probably leave it for this evening, ladies and gentlemen. Okay. Questions?
Dr. John, maybe you can stop share your screen, please.
Okay, yep. Sorry. There you go.
So I think we have a couple of questions. Will it be okay for you to take the questions, Dr. John?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah? All right. So as I could see, we have a question from Sachin R. Hebar. He says, sir, for a research scholar, collecting the literature for the study will be a hurdle. Kindly suggest the best e-data library for collecting data examples.
Well, the best thing I would suggest is to continue to read other qualitative research articles as good examples. I always like to do my research on Google Scholar. And if I were to research on Google Scholar, I would type in my keywords, and I would be looking for those papers that Google Scholar brings up, because what it does, it runs an algorithm and it gets very specific about what your search terms are. And then it also ranks the papers in order of citation. So you get the most important ones. Research databases are is for scholarly done. I use another one called Factiva. I don't know if you've heard of Factiva. It's from Dow Jones. Our university has it. It does cost money, I believe, to have a subscription to it. It's not cheap, but it's a great resource for understanding all the news about businesses. So, for example, the Financial Review and the New York Times and all those kind of and business sections are all in that database. I think one of the problems with qualitative research too is unlike quant research. Quant research has tons and tons of databases you can subscribe to understand, to get data. There are starting to be some of these. So I use a website called corporateregister.com. And corporateregister.com, if you're doing research in sustainability, in company reporting or integrated reporting, lists all of the, I think it's got about 130,000 different corporate reports that are actually listed there as one source of data. And I think the other thing we have to realize is that, as we said before with the research methods, most of the hard work in qualitative research is actually going around doing the interviews and the focus groups and gathering the data, because it's time consuming but rewarding.
Yeah, so the second question I will read out for you is, we have Dr. Kawa from Erbil. He wants to ask you, so people say that the quantitative research processes are organized in a linear and deductive manner, while qualitative research processes are organized in a circular and inductive manner. What exactly do we, how do we decipher this?
Well, I think it goes back to what I was talking before. It's not so much inductive, but abductive reasoning. So have a look at the kind of reasoning. And it has, if you read Robert Yin's book, and a lot of people say Yin's a positivist because he likes these chains of evidence and so forth. And he even advocates almost qualitative hypotheses. Well, you can do that. But at the end of the day, you have lots of different research methodologies that, for example, grounded theory, where you start out without any preconceived ideas. And I think all research is circular. I teach my PhD students sometimes that, just when you start doing the research, then you might think, oh my God, I've now done the wrong literature review. I have to revise the literature review because I need more information to inform me more about what I'm actually seeing in my data. And I like to use the example that when I was finishing my thesis, the day before I submitted it to my supervisor, I think I changed my research question because I had to rethink what that was. So absolutely, qualitative research is an iterative process. It's not linear. It looks linear when you write it up, but it's messy. It's like spaghetti when you do it, and it looks like lasagna when you finished it.
Thank you, Dr. John. We have another question, quite an interesting one, from Dr. Abdul Malik Sayed. He says, how do you quantify the intellectual capital for higher education institutes? I'm currently working on a research paper on efficiency and productivity of higher education institutes and interested in measuring their intellectual capital too. Could you please provide a framework?
So measuring intellectual capital is one of the great unknown secrets of the world. And I think that's a very good question. There's a paper I did with Professor Secundo from Italy. We looked at a dynamic capabilities perspective and understand. We actually tried to look at what stage the different universities are. Measuring intellectual capital can be done in many different ways. One of the better papers that I published out of my thesis was a very critical approach to measuring intellectual capital. So I actually used some statistical methodologies and correlations to do that. So you might find that paper interesting. It's actually on, if you go to my Google Scholar, you can see that. And it's called Measuring Intellectual Capital, a Critical Approach. And I think there's just there's many different ways of measuring intellectual capital. And I think I think when you go back to the balanced scorecard, there's some very valuable information from Kaplan and Norton, which, the balanced scorecard I consider the foundational framework for intellectual capital. And they said, really, you have to experiment with your measurement. Measure what you need to measure, and you can count, for example, number of graduates, research papers published, the impact of those research papers. We're doing it all the time. And if those metrics, those numbers mean something to you that you can use to better manage the organization, then I think that's the measure of intellectual capital that you use. And Kaplan and Norton's basically say, well, these numbers change on a constant basis. And that because they change on a constant basis, because your strategy changes, the business changes, the outcomes change. So therefore, when you measure these things, you look for different outcomes. We wrote a paper about that also. We call it Measuring for Managing, and it's an IC practice case study. And it was about not a university, but a government department that really finally realized after years of trying to find the exact measures that they didn't want to find the measures. They only wanted to find the measures that really needed to be focused on. So if you think about this from like a KPI perspective, I think what you do is you understand what KPIs are driving your business the same way as any other business do, because in the end of the day, intellectual capital is another form of management accounting. And it's the same thing. You pick up the numbers, you drive and strive towards the numbers. You might achieve that strategy. You might change your strategy so that the numbers change. So, but have a look. We did a special issue in Journal of Intellectual Capital in 2017 on IC and education. And there's a lot of really good papers in that special issue that you might be able to draw on as well.
So we have quite a lot of questions, as I could see in question and answer box, but because of time constraint, maybe I can take one or two more questions, and I request the participants to mail the question. I'll share with you his email ID, and maybe you can, send, can I take that?
Yep.
Dr. John, is it fine with you?
Yeah, send the whole, keep them on the chat and send the emails. I don't know if I can answer all of them, but I want to categorize them and send something. You can put something together. You can send that.
One or two more questions before we just end up this session. So we have Deepak Kumar. He asks, you talked about NVivo. What is the difference between NVivo and Max QDA, and which one would you recommend for thematic data analysis?
Well, I've heard of MaxQD. I will admit that I have not used it myself personally. I've been an NVivo devotee since I started my thesis. Why? Because my university gave me a free copy. It was Australian, and it was the one that I think is most popular. I'm not too sure if MaxQD is an open source. I'm not too sure about that one. However, look, I like NVivo because it is used, I know in Australia, in the Western world, it's used much, much more. I think MaxQD in some European countries is more popular than NVivo. NVivo, I think, is sometimes cost prohibitive if you don't get it from your university. It can be an expensive, very expensive program. I hear that from my university, my colleagues in Europe. But ever since I've been in academia, since I did my PhD, my university has always supplied me with a copy to use. So that's why I've done it. So, but look, any of those, I think in the book that we've got coming out on interventionist research, we have a thing about qualitative software analysis. And I think if you Google it, there's a little page that you can find that compares all the different programs. There's probably about 30 or 40 different ones that you can get. But both of those, MaxQD and NVivo, would be more than adequate for your needs.
All right. Thank you. So we have a whole lot of questions, and I think a couple of good feedback also. You've generated a whole lot of interest in the faculty members and PhD scholars attending this session. So it was lovely having you with us, Dr. John, and in the interest of following time for the webinar, I'll have to now end this session of, so maybe we can have another session and maybe a longer one to get more insights as a researcher too. That will be of help. And yeah, thank you so much. And,
thank you very much.
Yeah. So I think you'll have to leave, or will you continue with us?
I will try to continue for a little while and then see how we go. Okay, good. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Dr. John. Over to you, Dr. Anand, for the upcoming session.
So good evening to you all. I think Dr. Johannes has taken to wisdom of qualitative research methods from the perspective of editors. Now we have another researcher here, professor here. He has done a lot of work with the qualitative research methods in finance as well as marketing. So he is with us. We are lucky to have him over here today to share his views on from the perspective of researcher. So I will take the pleasure of introducing Professor Sujoy Bhattacharya. He is presently working as Associate Professor at Vinod Gupta School of Management, IIT Kharagpur. This is one of the top leading institute in India, and we are happy to have him here for this occasion. And coming to your background, he's a seasonal researcher, and he has quite a lot of research work. If you Google his name with Sujoy Bhattacharya, Google Scholar, you will get a lot of research papers produced by him along with the impact citation also. And he is also working with the qualitative research methods, and he also taught doctoral courses workshops in IIM Rohtak and Department of Management Studies IIT Madras, and he also taught MBA level in XLRI Jamshedpur. And he has got a lot of work with the NVIVO software data analysis as well as RQDA also. And I had a pleasure of working with him. We were a colleague before in Goa Institute of Management almost for 4 or 5 years, and happy to see him through virtual mode after almost 1 decade. So I will not take more time. I think there is giving introduction is of Sujoy Bhattacharya is never-ending story. I don't waste the time. Mr. Professor Bhattacharya will take you to the world of qualitative research methods in finance from the perspective of a researcher. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for inviting me for this session. So I used to work a lot with NVIVO, but of late I have switched to the open source alternative to NVIVO, the RQDA, and somehow that has caught my fancy and I have started using it. So, and I believe that a lot of things can be achieved through the open source revolution. Fine. So apart from being a qualitative researcher, I am also in the area of business analytics. So I am at one extreme working on machine learning techniques. I code a lot with Python, and on the other hand, I have started using this RQDA. Earlier, I was using the NVIVO. Fine. So today, Professor John has talked about the perspective of qualitative research from the point of view of an editor. I'll try to critique a paper within this limited time, and I'll talk about the process and the approach of one qualitative method, the grounded theory. Fine. So I have shared a paper with you. So I'm sure you have received the paper. So I'll share the screen and talk about the paper. So it's a very low level work, not a high level work I'm trying to do. Fine. And this is the paper I'm sure everybody has received. Right. So the paper which is with you is the, right? You all received it, right? Okay. I'm sure you can see the screen. So yes.
Yes. So Professor, go
yes,
ahead, please.
Yes. So the paper is that this is an Emerald journal, and this is a journal which publishes in the qualitative research area. And I'm talking about the disclosure for the top management teams, organizational learning. I talked about survival and failure in the period of study between 1990 and 2017. So I'll talk about what is it that is qualitative in this paper. So the primary focus of this work has been the corporate financial communications. And they are also talking in terms of the public and the private disclosure. So this is the focus of this paper. And then we are trying to, they are trying to explain how come that the banks developed financial communications and what kind of problems emerged during the global financial crisis. So it's an event study for a delta T period of time wherein the global financial crisis happened, and the theme is how is it that once we are dealing with the financial communications, both from the public perspective and the public disclosure perspective. Fine. So this is basically what they're trying to do. Fine. So they have used case study method. They have linked both the case study method as advocated by Yin and also the grounded theory approach. And they have built some cases, and they're trying to contrast these cases and draw lessons from those cases. So they are highlighting how is it that the construction, the destruction of the social knowledge and the communications from the perspective of the financial communications happened over these periods. They are just trying to contrast these out. Right? So what do they learn is that, so this is a standard format for an Emerald journal. And every Emerald journal now follows this format. So what they find is that there is something called a dominant coalition, which is seen to exist in the banks, and this happened in the bank of management, and this was stimulated by a gradual change which happened, and then the management then learned, and this is something which they demonstrate with data, how to accumulate social and cultural capital, and developed something called habitus. So Bourdieu has given this concept long back from social classes, and how classes try to preserve their structures and the hierarchies. So from there, this idea has been taken, and they try to show through data how this is happening. So they also point out that there are certain rapid changes which have happened, and certain secrecy factors have led to the internalization of the shareholders' wealth. So this is something which is actually linking the habitus and the market for information. So there's a market for information which exists for every bank, and this habitus is getting linked to the market for information. So they're also using a term coined by Morgan called psychic prison, and saying that this psychic prison is something which is a result of that dominant coalition which the banks have gone into, and that has created riskier bank cultures. So these are the findings they have derived from a complete qualitative research. Then again, following the standard Emerald, the way the presentation is made on the abstract. So the limitations are, there are sociological concepts have been brought into banking research. So this is the newness they have done. And they are talking in terms of financial information and linking it to bank culture. And we can see that how can regulation in this case lead to avoidance of a crisis. So they also point out to the fact that they have taken a less number of banks, and the range of the qualitative data which they have presented is limited. Fine. So the impact of this in terms of practical implications is the change processes have to be made more visible, and there have to be new contexts and knowledge and connections which actually link to bank risk, and the performance has to be monitored through improved regulator action. So that this is something from the regulator's perspective. So regulators would then require the banks to make visible the change processes, the new context. So this is what they really bring out. Fine. So the social implication is that there are some masking, and there are some they have restricted the bank exposure, and they have weakened the bank performance. So when this kind of a work comes in, so I was looking at some of the questions which were coming, as in, how do you really get this idea from? I mean, how do you really start in terms of knowing what kind of a problem to pursue? So the first things first. So there's a maxim in qualitative research given by Glaser long back 1978, and he says all is data. So everything you see is data. So the choice of the problem which you are actually going for is also part of the data. So I'll give a quick introduction with this background. How can a problem be chosen? A problem may come from different sources. A problem is not that it cannot come from a literature. but the qualitative researchers would believe that you need to have an open mind. The problem as defined by the literature may not be the only source of a problem. It could be your experience, it could be your embeddedness in a social group, or it could be looking at an existing data in a new way. That could give insights into certain set of events which could give you a problem definition, which also is evolving over time. So I'll quickly go through the first 3-4 slides of my presentation and then come back to this paper once more. So I'll keep on flipping between the presentation and the paper. Fine. So all his data, this is what I pointed out. The first thing Glaser says, the father of grounded theory along with Strauss, he says, ask the question, what is happening here? That means when you see some data, you need to really ask a high level question of how to make sense out of it. Then you'd understand every data in qualitative research from a social process perspective. And also you should look at it from a basic social psychological process perspective. So this is how you need to approach the qualitative data based research. So the first question is always what is happening here, and the fact that you're choosing a problem itself is a part of a data, right? So there are certain things which can really get us started in terms of give us good ideas, right? So again, this would frame the kind of questions you will ask, to whom to ask the questions, and so on. So for example, in the bank case, organizational learning is a process which could have been seen as fundamental, but for certain perspectives from certain players, this could have been marginal. So this distinction between a process which can be a marginal process and a fundamental process from the bank's perspective would give two different views of the same problem. So then, so how these social processes emerge as in what they formalized during some previous period? Is it that they have been constant throughout the period? Is it that they are temporal and quickly evolving? And are they emergent rapidly? These kind of questions should be answered. So for example, the organization learning process in a bank would be very different long back and would be evolving rapidly. So we need to look at this temporal nature of the organization learning in a bank. So this would be coming under the preview of grounded theory or qualitative research also. So then the question we need to ask is, what kind of actions the participants take such as to create this social process, in this case organization learning for the paper. So if the participants are having certain actions which they take which actually build up this organization learning infrastructure and the systems and the processes for it, this is something which would be a part of my study. So just looking at the first 2 points, you see the breadth of the coverage for qualitative research. So earlier I would have only studied organizational learning from a single perspective. Now my perspective itself is different. So I say organizational learning is fundamental from some people's perspective and marginal from some people's perspective. I'm looking at organizational learning as emergent temporally. I'm also saying there is an action which the participants are taking which is able to construct the organizational learning of a bank. So many issues come up so quickly in that context. Then who exerts control over these processes and under what conditions? So who is actually creating the system for the organizational learning in the bank, and what are the conditions which enable such people to exert these control over the organizational learning systems? Remember, we had something called habits. So this is something which we believe that is creating information which is not being revealed to the public, but we don't know the processes, the organizational learning, and who are the people, the agencies who are actually controlling processes and the context. So this is something which is coming under a qualitative research perspective, right? So I'll stop at the first slide and go back to the paper again. I'll keep on flipping between them. Then the processes may mean different things to different people. The same organizational learning process can mean completely different things to different people. How do they talk about it? their perception of the organizational learning process in a bank. What do they make sense out of it, and whatever they express about it? What is it that they emphasize on it, and what is that part of the organizational learning process they believe is unimportant, they might like to leave it out? Right. So then the last point is that if these organizational learning processes change, then how do they ascribe meanings to the change, and what are the kind of actions they take once they are dealing with the process of change in organizational learning in this context? Fine. So I'll move on. I'll go back to my paper. Okay. Now, can you see the PDF back?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So then I'm doing a very broad, high-level understanding of this paper, but I'm trying to do a low-level understanding of the method. Fine. So I have 15 minutes, I have been told. Right. So what is the focus of this paper? The focus is about bank learning, about the financial communications, and obviously there's a market for information. So in that market for information, the financial communications. This is the focus of the paper. And the questions is, how did bank develop their financial communications before the crisis hit and during the crisis? So this transition period and the comparison is what we'll try to do. Okay, so it studies the periods of 1990 to 2000 and also 2000 to 2008. So two periods are looked at during the crisis periods. Fine. So this is how they are writing the paper, and the contribution is highlighted in the introduction itself. So the emergence, the stream of qualitative literature in finance is being contributed to, and the specificity is in terms of the disclosure content. So once they are talking in terms of accounting disclosure content, they are saying that past studies have also done it, and my paper also contributes to it, because I'm talking in terms of financial disclosures and the success and failures during the learning part during the two crisis periods. So this is the contribution of the work. Okay, so I'll just skip some part and move on. So then it also talks about the fact that the paper talks about the structure and behavior of corporate financial communication. So it talks about what is the formal structure and the informal structure, fine, and what kind of behaviors were actually exhibited by the players for those banks for which case studies were developed for financial communications, right? And the disclosure activity, especially during the periods of change. Some of them led to success and some of them led to failure. So this is a broad picture which is built up. So at this stage, I hope that a high level view of the paper is achieved. Would you like to ask anything about the problem we are trying to solve through a qualitative research? One or two questions and then I can move on.
I think we will keep the question at the end, Dr. Sujoy.
Okay, fine.
So one more thing, this attendees are not able to see the presentation. Is it possible to share the presentation also when needed?
The presentation also? Okay.
Only the PDF is shared.
Okay, so I share the presentation also. The presentation is actually on the GT, the method part, I mean the ground level thing. So the meaning can be understood when both things are joined together. The paper is seen from the eyes of the presentation. Then we'll be able to handle this point. Fine. Any case, I'm mailing the presentation to the professor, and you can share that also. Fine. 1 second. So I'll just move on in the meanwhile, and then I'll get back to you. Fine. Okay. So what we are interested in, as I told you, I'm interested in the structure and the behavior of the financial communications from the corporate perspective, and the disclosure activities, which can lead to success or we can lead to failure. Fine. So we just talk in terms of the core research problem addressed. So we are addressing the concerns how development of bank financial communications has contributed to the problem in information production, markets and banks. This is what I had talked about earlier. So primarily the focus is on the financial communications as created by the banks that has actually led to the problems in the production of information which is shared with the public. So there's a public disclosure, fine, and with the markets then and the banks. So this is the first part. This is the broad problem we are dealing with. So then the second section is dealing with the sources of data and the use of grounded theory to make sense out of it. Fine. So what is it that we are trying to understand from grounded theory perspective? We are trying to understand one minute, I'll just take the pen. Okay. So we are talking in terms of the understanding for bank learning for financial communications. This is the basic theme of the work, fine, and the subsequent problem. So if we talk in terms of the context and the problem statement, the context is the crisis periods, which is studied for 2 periods, and the processes which are studied are the bank learning systems and the financial communications to the public, stock market, and other banks. This is what we study. Fine. So I'll skip some part and move on. Fine. Then, so what they say is that we have created a sneak peek into the investigated scene. So we are giving brief insights or a sneak peek into the investigated scene. So what is the sneak peek into the investigated scene? They have tried to give a snapshot view of the data which they have created, and we'll introduce coding as and when we go along. So they have used some coding and tried to bring out some structure in the data. Okay. So, and they have also created something called a theoretical narrative. So the theoretical narrative is emergent, which is grounded in the data. So it's not something which is coming out of thin air. It's emergent and coming from the data. It's grounded in data. Fine. So this is it, and they thereby provide a map to move through the paper. So this is what we are moving through. So then something called richness of data is being talked of. Fine. So I'll talk about this richness of data now. Fine. So we have understood the problem. So I'll just summarize in 3 lines. We are studying the crisis period, which has come twice. We are studying organizational learning. We are understanding the communications which are being done by the bank to the external agencies, that is to the public stock market and also to other banks. Fine. And we are seeing the organizational learning for that. This is the context in which we are studying. And now we'll talk about what is a rich data, and I'll go back to my paper. So okay. So I'll skip some part of the PPT. I'll come back later back. Fine. So the rich data actually comes from multiple sources. The rich data is notes which you can get from your individual records. Right? You're recording things down, or collective actions. You have done some group work, fine, and you are being able to create an interface from where you are able to collect data, and you are able to take detailed notes with anecdotes and your personal observations. So you are able to document significant processes in that particular setting. You can also look at the tone of the language and the context of the language which is being talked of, right? So the people who are responding, place them in the context and place them in the scene, and then focus on what we call as key analytical ideas. So this is what we like to initially do, start with this, right? So same from the paper which we are looking at. What is the scene of the action, and where and how does the action take place? So this organizational learning, which is leading to marketing, which is leading to the communications from the bank's perspective to internal, external players. What is the setting of this action? When and how does this action take place? This question must be answered. Once you really start collecting data, this data must answer the question. So what's going on? This is exactly the first question which I raised as given by Glaser. What is the overall activity being studied? So when you collect the data, this question should be in your mind. The relatively long-term behavior about which the participants organize themselves. Right? So you look at what is the long-term behavior from a behavioral perspective. What is the long-term behavior? which they are organizing themselves. Right. Then the distribution of participants in space and time. Now this is very important. Space and time in where they're located in space, and some people have left. Some people formed the organization learning structure earlier. What was their contribution and what is the contribution of the people now? So this is a time ordering which we might like to do. Right? So how are the actors organized? That means what is the structure? What organizations affect, oversee or regulate or promote this activity? So there's a structure which is actually leading to this kind of an activity, in this case organizational learning. Are they stratified? Is there a hierarchy? Who is in charge? Does being in charge vary by activity? So is it a process by process charge keeps on changing? How is this membership achieved and maintained? So membership means you are a part of that system which is creating the organizational learning process culture for the bank which we are studying. How is it achieved and how do you maintain it? So what do actors pay attention to? That means what are the important things from the organizational learning perspective and the communication to the external and internal players, and which of them are important, which of them are preoccupying, and which of them are critical. So when you actually were to collect the data and were to create a case study, these are the kind of questions you would like to answer. Fine. So I'm again looking at it from the paper's perspective, and I'm looking at it from the perspective of the data collection part. These questions must be answered when you collect the qualitative research. Okay. So actually this is huge, right? So, but some of these I have tried to highlight. So this is called as rich data. So rich data will make your theory emergent from the data. So this would be grounded in data, and the richness of the data will ensure what we'll later on call as theoretical saturation. Right. So do they ignore what the other persons might pay attention to? Is it something which is very, very important you believe or somebody else believes which they are ignoring? Right. Fine. What symbols do they invoke to understand their worlds? So every world is having certain symbols, some metaphors. So we need to understand that part, the participants and processes within them, and the objects and events they encounter. So what are the objects and events they are encountering when they are designing or maintaining the organization learning system, which is leading to communications. Right? So what names do they attach to objects, event, persons, roles, setting, and equipment? Fine. So how do they call these people? So names does not mean only name, but a description and meaning of those names also. Fine. So these are the rich questions, as I say, we'll look at. So then to be able to maintain the organizational system, what practices, skills, the stratagems and methods of operation do these actors, that means the people who are in the bank, on whom you're creating the case, they employ. Right. Then, so what theories, motives, excuses and justifications and other explanations do these people who are in the organization learning use in accounting for their participation? Accounting for their participation means justifying their participation, showing that this participation is leading to something. So how do they theorize that this is something which would lead to, say, betterment of the bank or otherwise? What motives do they have? What excuses they have, saying that I don't want to be a part of this group? That also is rich data. And what justifications and other explanations the people who are creating that system and maintaining the system for organization learning, they might be giving. Right. So what goals do the actors seek when, from their perspective, is an act poorly done? Very, very important idea. So what is it that the organization learning system as created by the actors seek to achieve, and how do they know that an act is poorly as their perspective? How do they judge actions by what standards? So they judge a poorly created, poorly done action, and also we need to know what are the standards by which they are judging an action, and who has actually developed those standards by which they are judging whether their performance for maintenance and creation of the organization learning system is being reviewed, developed and applied by whom. So look at the same idea of organization learning being approached by multiple different perspectives. And this is what we try to call as a rich data in qualitative research. So this is like Chalmers has given a very interesting idea saying what rewards do the actors gain from their participation. So if I do it, then what rewards do I get? So these questions are something which we look at once we are trying to collect the data from the field. So I'll go back to the paper. Now that we have looked at it, fine, right? So I'll come down from the paper's perspective, right? So I will talk in terms of something which we said, financial communications by a dominant coalition. So we are hypothesizing actually, and then we are proving. So initialization of the data might lead to generation of certain hypotheses. Then we try to form some theory, emergent theory, where we believe we are getting more and more support for the data. We are not talking in terms of a p-value for a hypothesis. Obviously, this is not quantitative research, but we are gathering more evidence and we are trying to achieve what we call as a theoretical saturation. So this dominant correlation has to be understood from multiple perspectives, and the dimensionality, I'll talk about this later on as I may move on. Fine. So I'll move on, right? So I'll skip certain part of it, right? Else I won't be able to complete this. So what they have found is that top management in banks, like some banks, were unthinking and uncritical in their imitation and conformity when developing internal financial communication functions, external MFI networks and disclosure activities. So this is something which they are getting out of the rich data they have collected. They're also saying that they are keeping up appearances. That is more important to them, and concealing information when conducting financial communications over a period of increased financialization. So this is something which again comes up, right? So there's a lot of pressure which has intensified, SWM pressure, as we have said. Fine. So these factors were central to the bank failure and also central to the bank survival. Some banks failed, some banks survived, and they're contrasting through case studies, right? So these empirical insights which they got from which questions, the questions we talked of earlier, these kind of questions which they asked is giving me the rich data, and they are that revealed the fragility, significance, and the function structures in the world of finance, right? And also pointed out the lacunas for the governance and the regulators to create a stable organizational learning system for transparent and proper communication to the external world, right? So they have developed a theoretical structure also, right? And I'll move on with this. So I'll just skip some part. And the research method they have used is grounded theory in this case. Fine. So the focus is on bank success and failure in learning during the one period 1990 to 2000 and 2000 to 2008, right? During the general financial crisis. So now look at the sources of the data. The two sources of data which are used in the bank are historical field research in banks by the author during this period. So look at the period of study, 1993 to 2001. They studied the historical field research in banks and other companies, and new public source of data on banks before and during the general financial crisis during the period 2011 to 2015. So there are two sources of data they have used, and which spreads over two different periods, as you can see. And this is field work which has been done, and some of it is published material, right? Okay, so moving on. So they also talk in terms of so my talk is a critique of this paper, fine. So the historical field research in banks, in the cited literature, they have already revealed many insights in bank learning. So the study theme is still bank learning, right? About their financial communication. So these are the two key ideas which we are trying to link, and then we are trying to say the linkages of these two ideas is linked to bank success or bank failures. And the two periods we are doing, 1990s to 2008 and beyond. right? So then a case material was developed for the period 1992 2000. This is what we did it, and they used the grounded theory view and learning about the financial communication. They created cases from the year 1993, 94, 95, 96, and 2001, right? So these cases are actually reflecting the case experiences which the bank has had over these periods, over this whole time period of study, right? So they have drawn this data from large UK banks, names given, and so they're not naming the banks, and they're just calling the banks A, B, C, D, E, right? So extensive field research, rich data gathering, case study building on the banks, and without naming the banks, though they have named the total bank, the set of the banks they have surveyed, but they're not individually naming the bank, they're just calling it A, B, C, D, E. Fine. So then something happens. So new public sources were developed from 2011 to 2015 in the form of major books and regulatory reports, such as the FSA reports. So this is something which is a new public source which certainly comes up from the year 2011. So a new source of data enters their study, right? So then there are newer insider interview information during 2008 to 2012. So another new source of data which is coming in. So you see the data sources for the periods are different. It is not that consistent data sources are used for the whole period. So for a certain period of time, a new data source enters, and for a certain period of time, insider interview information is also brought in by them to be able to get the richness of data. So data are of different genres, data are of different types, published literature, insider interview information, and old data which is also included in this study. Okay, so thereby they are able to bring out the new insights into the bank's failure and the bank problems for the country studied, UK, during the general financial crisis and afterwards, right? Okay, so I would just talk about a minute about this. So they have used case and archival data for the banks for a very large period of time, and also historical case data is available, as I did talk of. Fine. So they have tried to bring out a grounded theory of bank financial communications and learning and the associated problems which they have had. Fine. So moving on, so it's now richness of the data part is done. I'll move on, right? So I'll talk in terms of what are the other things which needs to be done. There's a lot of work which is a lot of literature and material which is there on how to interview. There's a lot of material on how to code, find open coding and axial coding. But so I have paucity of time, so I will not talk in terms of how to code this data. Fine, which is a separate session altogether. Fine. So generally speaking, I'll give you an overview of things. Once you get this data, we start with open coding. So what we are doing is we are giving codes to blocks of data, and we are linking the data to concepts. So okay. So can I take a minute and change the screen share for a minute? Fine. I'll just talk about this idea for a minute. I'll stop the share. I'll create a new screen share. Fine. I'll create a whiteboard and I'll talk about the idea of code. So you have a data as you saw, right? And can you see the whiteboard now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So when you have this lot of data, so we use a concept called open coding. So these are some of the coding techniques which I will just touch upon today. So what does open coding do? Open coding actually breaks up the data which you have collected into concepts. So this is a data which you have got. So there's a lot of information which you have gathered over a period of time. From there, say some sentences are grouped together and a concept 1 say is brought. So open coding is nothing but breaking the text analysis, text part into concept 1, and in NVivo or RQDA, which you might be using, will be able to link the concept to the blocks of data. So the concept 2 can be linked to second block of data. The concept 3 could be linked to some other block of data, and there could be an overlap also. So we are breaking the text part into concepts. So we have a set of concepts which we go with. Fine. This is called as open coding. Fine. And then what we also say is we have something called an initial coding, which we do, right? So this initial thing, if you look at this, we try to bring out as many concepts as possible, and then we try to relook at it. And so from another perspective, we see if we have left out some, is it a perspective that I could not bring it? So maybe the concept was linked to some other thing, or some concept has been missed out, or the concept itself has to be revised. So when I really look at this, this is called as focused coding, right? So we go for focused coding, and there is something which we do. These concepts are grouped together. So this is one approach into what we call as categories. So these concepts are grouped into categories, and these categories have something called a dimensional range. So these categories are having dimensional range. So category 1 is linked to category 2 at a certain dimensional range, right? So this linkage is what is called as axial coding in grounded theory. And this axial coding has been critiqued by Glaser a lot, because he believes that this is forcing the data, while Strauss and Corbin, which is the other strand of grounded theory, have accepted it. But in any case, we can definitely link the categories at the dimensionals ends of the dimension and bring out the structure in terms of an emergent theoretical structure. This is basically a very high level view of how to handle this kind of a data. Fine. So the process is repeated. You take the data, get out the concepts, you try to form categories, and from the categories you are trying to link the categories using something called an axial coding, which is linking the concepts at their dimensional ranges, at some dimensional ranges. So thereby all the categories come together and some kind of a theoretical structure emerges from the data. Now, if this is the case, we don't stop. The moment we believe that some categories don't have adequate data support, we go back to the field. We go back to the field, take more data, and try to saturate the categories. So we keep on collecting data till no new patterns are coming from the data, and this is what we call as theoretical sampling. Theoretical sampling is nothing but, it's not random sampling. It is about going to the field and collecting data. This is purposively done such that if you have a category which is not saturated, you don't have data support for it, or certain categories don't have data at the dimensional ranges, I will go to the field and try to collect data at those dimensional ranges of those categories. So this is purposive and has a name theoretical saturation. So once the theoretical saturation is achieved, again, from a field work perspective, from a practical perspective, this theoretical saturation is really not achieved. Fine. But assuming realistically speaking it is achieved, so we say that we have an emergent theory at hand, and we say the moment I have a category with a dimensional range, fine. So organizational learning say is very poor, and organization, I'm giving a very rudimentary example. So this is a category 1. Organizational learning is a category, and organizational learning is structured. So I don't have support for structured. So I go to the field and get data in text which will be supporting the structured part. So this is what we will try to do. We'll try to increase that dimensional range as much as possible. So I have a category with the dimensional range coming out clearly, right? So when the category is say organizational learning, structured organizational learning is one aspect, one dimension, one extreme of the dimension, and it is poor. So when I relook at the data, I say no, it's not poor, it is unstructured. So we have unstructured organizational learning and structured organizational learning. So this unstructured or the structured organizational learning can be controlled, can be linked to another category, which can be seen in terms of the hierarchy of organizational learning. So the hierarchy of the organizational learning is high. Maybe we'll have a structured organizational learning. If the hierarchy is low in this category, then we'll have an unstructured learning. So you have a theory which suddenly emerges from the data. Fine. So this is what I'm talking about. So you get the data, create the open codes, create categories, try to do something called an axial coding, or try to link the categories at their dimensional ranges. Let the theory emerge. Fine. This is one way of doing the analysis. There are multiple methods of doing the analysis. Then what do? We write something called memos. Memos are your own. You're talking to yourself. You are, make out my handwriting. I'm writing, on the laptop. You're talking to yourself means these are your field notes. This is a justification of why you are creating a concept and calling it open code. And why is it that you are creating a category and calling it this as a category? So this is like your own reasoning why you have created the categories and why you have created the concepts. These are called as memos. Memo writing is very important because many of the times you're working in a team. So fieldwork happens in a team. So I really sometimes don't understand why my co-researcher has kept the categories the way they have kept. Then the best thing to do is look at the person's memos. Then I understand what is going on in that person's mind, which is the reason for the categories and the dimensions and the linkages emerging the way it is. Right? So this is what I would like to talk about. So once the memoing is done, okay, so then finally some emergent theory comes in and we do talk about that. I'll stop the share and come back to the wait. I have to stop this share. How do I stop it? Pause share. Right, got it. Okay. New share. I'll go back to my paper. Right? So I've come back to my paper. Can you see the paper now? No. Are you able to see the paper?
No.
Okay, I'll do it again. Give me a minute. I'll share the screen. I'll go back to the paper. Now, can you see the paper?
Yeah.
Right. So this is the emergent. So this is the yes. So this is the emergent theory which comes up. I'll show you. Are you able to see the structure? So in this structure, the categories which have come and which have been linked is the internal structure and power in a bank. This was one category, and there was a dominant coalition on board and top management. So at the board level and the top management level, there is a dominant coalition which was shown to exist. So the internal structure of the bank is one category for which the dominant coalition is a subcategory within the internal structure of the bank, as you can see, right? So what does it do? As you can see, so it learns about, so it's something which is an organization learning perspective is being talked of. You keep on learning the financial communication, you learn the structure, and the power is also understood. So disclosure, content, and conduct. This is the behavior aspect of the category which we have formed. So these are the categories which emerge and how internalize the SWM values at top bank, and this is able to disseminate the values in bank. So these are some of the categories which are coming in the internal bank learning. They're all coming from the categorization of the data. Then a second category comes out, which is called as a lookout. That means bank is learning about the bank markets, is learning about the risks, the profits, right? It's also the first year in the social and economic networks for the MFIs, fine, micro financial institutions. and then the structure and power within that is also being learned about within MFI. And then we also have a second tier networks. So these two are getting linked at their dimensional ranges. So what is happening? There is a continuous two-way learning which is emergent from the theoretical data, and then they are learning about through the interactions, and their information and learning is passing back and forth. As you can see, there's a two-way communication which is being shown. Fine. Then stock markets are getting this information from the stock markets are passing to the MFI, which is going all the way to internal bank learning. Fine. Fine. So this is a kind of a structure which has emerged from the qualitative research. Fine. So I won't take too much time, but I'll just talk about. So the description of these looking in the categorizations has been talked of here. Fine. And you can see that some snippets for banks are given here, as you can see. And the snippets of the bank which are given here are being talked of in terms of specialist IR function. How is the bank for with evidence? This is the interview transcript getting linked to a open code and then getting linked to the category. So Bank D, the quote is, in the past 2 years, we have developed a new bank structure combining the chief executive, finance director, and investor relations staff, and we have become much more active in investor relations. So this is something which is cited as an evidence for support for the categorization which you are doing. So your research paper would expect you to do that. Similarly, so if there is a coercive pressure, this is also being cited for another bank F. So evidence is not the whole transcript for the interview, which could be very large. Snippets of information could be cited for your categorization. Fine. So similarly, other snippets of information for the categorization, which you have talked about in a figure there and described it, have been given. Fine. Okay. So I think I have done a basic intro part. Fine. So similarly, the second tier networks have been talked of, right? And so the whole, so what is the new thing then? The new thing is we could have never understood the organization learning from a quantitative perspective alone. This richness of it's just not coming from any existing which is being created. Fine. So is it true? I mean, what is the generalizability of this? So thing is, it is plausible. It is plausible. We don't know. We'll have to see it out with more evidence. But this is something which we can talk about as a from this, and this can be taken for a success versus failure. They have contrasted these two, the same structures for the structure, the success, and the same structures for the failure. They have contrasted between the categories and the concepts for structures and failures. Then they have tried to bring out the differences. Fine then. So $520, I believe. Professor, any questions from?
Anand sir, your mic is mute.
Thank you, Professor Sujoy Bhattacharya, for wonderful insight. So now it's question and answer session. So I begin with few questions, and later on we can take few questions from the audience. Well, Professor, you have at the end you said that regarding generalizability.
I saw, is there a longer study period?
Pardon? Hello.
Yes.
Hello, doctor. Hello.
Is something you can read up, something called.
Okay. I'm just so regarding you have raised one important question, that is generalizability of qualitative research results. So I just wanted to ask you, so normally qualitative research means it is based on opinions and non-quantitative methods. So now if you come out a conclusion with the opinion of a small focus group study or something, so how can you make it generalize the result?
Okay, so I would like to, change the context.
Okay.
So if I have an emergent theory and the emergent theory is robust to the change of context, fine. So in this case, we say this is the organizational learning which is happening. Fine. We keep on flipping the context. Organizational learning for success and organizational learning for failure. So we also talk in terms of organizational learnings for other banks. So then we see a similarity in the structure which is coming in. Then we say this theory might be generalized. Fine. So the only thing which we can do is we can always keep on adding new contexts to the emergent theory, and then we can say we are moving towards generalizability.
Okay, fine. Thank you, Professor. So now you know that nowadays emerging area is behavioral finance, and we can see lot
Yes.
of work in behavioral finance, and but using quantitative technique. So my question is, can you make the research better in behavioral finance or behavioral economics using qualitative study than quantitative?
Yes, actually, much of the research in behavioral finance is moving towards mixed method research. So mixed method research will have a combination of the qualitative research methods, learnings from that, and then quantitative research also joins.
Mhm. Okay.
Yes, because the questions to be asked as of now, the heuristics which we will really bring out, the biases of the consumers would maybe vary from context to context. So to know those biases, I need to have a qualitative research
Okay.
and then
So
take it over.
okay, fine. So now when it comes to qualitative research, can we use a structured questionnaire using closed or open-ended questions in qualitative research?
Okay, so the recommendation is that you have some initial questions which you have at the back of your mind.
Okay.
Some of it could be structured, but the moment you have got some answers and you have got those answers, based on that you have generated open codes, the answers would lead you to further questions. So it's not one round of Q&A and stop. It is multiple rounds of Q&A because you're trying to achieve theoretical saturation.
Okay.
So you might have some initial questions. At that point, once you start initial questions, the answer should prompt you to ask more questions. So a part of it could be known to you, the questions. A part of it is to be asked at that very point of time, or maybe later once you go back and do your fieldwork, memoing.
Okay, then from my side, the question is over. Here, I will take the question from the audience. So there is one question from Dr. Rajiv Gupta. He has asked a question: which financial aspect in qualitative research should we consider while studying the impact of demonetization on MSME industries in India? So this is the question from Dr. Rajiv Gupta.
Right. So if I were to study demonetization per se, fine, I would study demonetization from a perspective of time, that is before and after. So that is very important. What was happening before, what is happening after, and the contrast between the working capital requirements maybe for the business, for an MSME, is what is being highlighted. So there will be certain MSMEs which will be able to bring out alternative sources of working capital, or would be able to have flexibility in their manufacturing processes, which will be able to overcome this demonetization impact. So what kind of organizations are there which have such capabilities, and learning from that, how is it that such capabilities can be developed in MSME such that such shocks are overcome? This is the kind of a study we might look at.
Okay, fine. So here we have one more question from Professor Sri Krishna Mahajan from Shivaji University, Kolhapur. He has asked a question about what are the softwares can be used for qualitative research in finance. He's asking what are the software can be used for qualitative research in finance, and which are open source out of them. This is the question.
Right. So, right, I'm a diehard fan of R, and so I have now gone to RQDA. I've sent that as a link in the chat, and you could see that out. Right, I am sending it to everyone. Right, no, I'll send it to everyone, all the participants.
Okay,
the panelists and attendees.
Okay, fine.
This is the one I would recommend. It would take some time to learn, but this is completely open source. NVivo is very costly. So NVO license getting, even for us, it takes a lot of money.
Okay.
So with this, you can more or less replicate everything you could do with NVO with an open source software.
Okay. Thanks for sharing.
And the documentation is very
Okay.
robust.
Okay. Thanks for sharing.
So examples and documentations are robust. You have lots of papers on them.
Okay, fine. So now, Dr. Sujoy, we have one more question from Dr. Niranjan Shetty. He is a faculty member in our college, College of Banking and Financial Studies. His question is how one researcher would ensure that a particular topic is fit case for qualitative research and there is no quantitative method available for the same. So this is the question.
So, so if you look at the way Glaser and Corbin and Strauss, they have been talking about, and Charma's been talking about qualitative research, they are saying qualitative research can be used to look at an existing phenomena from a new perspective, or to study an old phenomena from a new perspective, or to study a completely new phenomena. So two zones they have said this is fit cases for qualitative research: an old phenomena from a new perspective, or a completely new phenomena. So whenever you see any change happening in the world, that change is the ideal breeding ground for qualitative research.
So now we have a lot many questions. I will take last two questions, and so that we can wind up the session as scheduled. Well, so the next question is from Mr. Deepak Kumar. His question is, what are the best ways to quickly transcribe a long, in-depth interviews? Are there any software as well as for the same?
Yeah. So now we have lots of transcription softwares available. Many of them can be downloaded from a simple Android phone. You put that and the transcription happens. Many apps are there now which would transcription through a software is not a major issue.
Okay, fine. So there is one question from Dr. Sanjeev Kumar, that is, can you provide me some methodology for qualitative research in accounting and finance?
Yes, I could, after this I could share a list of the some reference material with you, and you could send it to the participants. Fine, you would see the reference material for qualitative research in pure accounting or in finance.
Okay, fine. So one last question. So here Ms. Fatika has raised this question. She is asking, could you please let me know some recommended readings to a beginner to learn thematic analysis, which can be used in mixed methods, that is exploratory sequential design?
Okay, so before you start with this, I would ask you to read the basic textbook of Discovery of Grounded Theory. That's the first reading you should do before you start with any qualitative research. Fine. Once you have done that, second, read the Sage Handbook of Qualitative Research Methods, which has a section of thematic analysis. Fine. So the handbook of Sage on qualitative research method is very nicely written. It covers most of the methods used in qualitative research, the handbook, and provide an answer. But before that, start with the Discovery of Grounded Theory as the first reading.
So, Dr. Sujoy, I think it's a time to say thanks to you. Still, there are many questions. I think we will shoot you back, and you can reply directly to the one who has raised the questions. And we really thankful to you for sharing your wonderful insight and critical review, which is really useful for beginners as well as even for the one who has done even to go to the next level. So we appreciate and thank for sharing your views and joining us in this webinar and making this highly successful. Thank you, one and all. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you. Thank you, professors. Thank you, professor. Bye-bye. Thank you for the participation. Thank you.
Over to Dr. Sushma.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Anand. So with that, we come to an end. And it's a pleasure to propose vote of thanks for this August event. On behalf of Finance and Banking area of Jaipuria Institute of Management and College of Banking and Financial Studies, Oman, I express my sincere thanks to one and all who has contributed in shaping up this event. Any knowledge sharing event becomes a success because of its key speakers and participants. They're the lifeline of the event, I believe. The two stalwarts, Dr. Johannes Dumay and Dr. Sujoy Bhattacharya, gave deep insights on the theme, which I'm sure many of us will take along. My heartfelt gratitude for their valuable insights. I sincerely thank all the participants for their active participation. And I express my heartfelt gratitude to the leadership teams of the two organizations, Jaipuria Institute of Management and College of Banking and Financial Studies, for their visionary leadership and continuous support in all the knowledge spreading activities and events. It's my sincere duty to acknowledge the efforts of my area colleagues here at Jaipuria for helping me in right from the stage of conceptualizing till the execution of this program. Last but not the least, a special word of thanks for the IT team who helped us in hosting it in a fluent manner. I would like to acknowledge the efforts of Mr. Amitabh Ghosh, the team head of IT at Jaipuria Institute of Management, for ably holding out this entire affair, right from the inception of the event to its detailed implementation. Once again, thank you one and all. And Dr. Anand, I think both of us are the co-owners of the event. So maybe in case you would like to express something to conclude. Yeah.
Thank you. You have covered everything. So on behalf of our college also, I thank one and all for their active participation, and we look forward your participation in the in our future activities also. Thank you one and all.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. See you. See you. I think we have to upload this one.
So I think
feedback link.
Yeah, the feedback, as soon as the participants will leave, they'll get to see the feedback link, and we request you to please fill